The laughter wasn't loud. That was the worst part. It came in soft bursts, polite, restrained, wrapped in silk scarves and expensive cologne. The kind of laughter meant to be shared only with those who understood the rules of places like this. First class. She stood in the aisle clutching a worn canvas bag, fingers curled tightly around the strap as if it were the only thing anchoring her to the floor. Her shoes were practical. Her coat was plain. Nothing about her announced wealth, influence, or belonging. And everyone noticed. A man in a tailored suit glanced up from his tablet, eyes flicking over her before narrowing in faint disbelief. A woman across the aisle leaned toward her companion and whispered something behind a manicured hand. "She must be lost," someone murmured, just loud enough. The flight attendant hesitated beside her, smile fixed but uncertain. "Ma'am," she said carefully, "are you sure this is your seat?" The woman nodded. Calm. Polite. Unbothered on the surface. "Yes," she replied. 12A. A pause. The attendant checked again. Then again. Her brow creased, not with doubt of the seat assignment, but of the person standing there. A ripple moved through the cabin. A man laughed softly. "First time flying, sweetheart," he said, voice dripping with amusement. "Coach is that way." A few smiles followed. Someone actually chuckled. The woman said nothing. She stepped into the seat and placed her bag at her feet with deliberate care. She smoothed her coat, buckled her belt, and looked straight ahead, as if the cabin around her were suddenly empty. That only made it worse. First-class passengers were used to recognition, nods, deference, subtle acknowledgement of status. Her refusal to react felt like a breach of etiquette. Or an insult. The whispers resumed. "Who does she think she is? Probably upgraded by mistake. These airlines really are lowering standards." The man across the aisle shook his head, smiling as if indulging a child. "Unbelievable," he muttered. The woman's gaze drifted briefly to the window. Outside, the aircraft gleamed beneath the afternoon sun, massive and immaculate. Her reflection stared back at her in the glass, composed, unreadable. She checked her watch. The laughter behind her swelled again, a little bolder now. None of them noticed the subtle shift in the cabin crew's behavior a few rows up. None of them saw the chief purser glance toward 12A, then straighten abruptly. None of them heard the sharp intake of breath when a name appeared on the manifest. And certainly none of them realized that the reason the woman remained so calm, so untouched by their judgment, was because she knew something they didn't. Something that would make this entire cabin very, very quiet. Very soon. The cabin door closed with a muted thud. Conversation resumed, but something in the air had shifted, an unease so faint it passed unnoticed by most. The woman in 12A remained still, hands folded neatly in her lap, eyes forward. She did not reach for the welcome drink. She did not glance at the menu. She waited. Up front, the chief purser leaned toward the cockpit, lowering his voice. The captain listened, brows drawing together as he glanced at the manifest on his tablet. He read the name once. Then again. His posture changed. "Are you certain?" he asked quietly. The purser nodded. "It's her." The captain exhaled slowly, then stood. Delay service. Back in first class, a man 2 rows ahead reclined his seat with a satisfied sigh. "You know," he said to no one in particular, "this is what happens when airlines start confusing access with merit." A few heads nodded in agreement. The woman behind him stiffened, then relaxed again, as if reminding herself of something. She reached into her bag, not hurriedly, not defensively, and withdrew a small envelope. No logos. No markings. She turned it over once in her hands, then slid it back inside. Across the aisle, the woman with the silk scarf finally addressed her directly. "You're very composed," she said, smiling thinly. Most people would be embarrassed. The woman in 12A turned her head slightly. Her expression was gentle. Almost kind. Embarrassment, she said softly, comes from believing other people define you. The smile across the aisle faltered. Before a response could form, footsteps approached from the front of the cabin, measured, purposeful. The captain emerged, uniform immaculate, expression unreadable. Conversations dwindled as passengers realized who it was. He stopped beside row 12. Every movement around them slowed. The captain looked down at the woman in 12A, then did something no one expected. He inclined his head. "Mrs. Hale," he said clearly, his voice carrying through the cabin, "welcome aboard." Silence fell like a held breath. The woman looked up at him, offering a small nod in return. "Thank you, Captain." The man who had laughed earlier froze mid-motion. The woman with the silk scarf went very still. And as the captain remained standing beside her seat, far longer than protocol required, the passengers of first class began to sense, with dawning clarity, that they had misread the situation entirely. Because captains did not greet passengers like this unless there was a reason. And whatever that reason was, it was about to change everything they thought they understood about the woman they had so casually dismissed. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. The captain turned slightly, addressing the cabin now, but his gaze lingered on the woman in 12A. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said calmly, "thank you for your patience. We'll be departing shortly." He paused, just long enough for the weight of expectation to build. "There is," he continued, "one brief matter to acknowledge before we do." A few passengers shifted in their seats. Someone cleared their throat. The woman in 12A lowered her eyes, as if hoping the moment might pass without ceremony. It didn't. The chief purser stepped forward, posture rigid, hands clasped behind his back. His eyes flicked briefly toward the woman, then to the rest of the cabin. "It's an honor to have you with us today, Mrs. Hale," he said. "Honor." The word echoed. The man across the aisle swallowed hard. The silk scarf woman's hand tightened around her glass. Someone in the back whispered, "Who is she?" The captain answered before anyone else could. "Mrs. Hale," he said, "is traveling under her own name today." A strange phrase. Deliberate. Chosen. She rarely does. A ripple of confusion passed through the cabin. The woman finally spoke again, her voice calm but firm. "Captain, it's really not necessary." He smiled, warm, respectful. "With respect, ma'am, it is." He turned back to the passengers. "For those unfamiliar, this aircraft, and every aircraft in our fleet, operates under the Hale Aviation Group." Murmurs erupted instantly. Hale Aviation was not just an airline. It was an empire. A name associated with acquisitions, innovations, and boardroom headlines. A name spoken with reverence in financial circles. The man who had laughed earlier felt his stomach drop. The captain continued, his tone even. "Mrs. Hale's husband founded the company. She prefers to travel quietly." The word quietly landed like a rebuke. Eyes snapped back to the woman in 12A, her simple coat, her worn bag, her steady composure. The contrast was dizzying. The silk scarf woman opened her mouth, then closed it again. The man in the tailored suit stared straight ahead, face pale. The woman in 12 a.m. Eastern Time, none of their gazes. She simply folded her hands once more, as if nothing had changed. But everything had. The captain nodded to her once more and stepped back. Service resumed in silence, movements precise, deferential. Yet no one could return to their screens or drinks. Because now, every whispered laugh replayed in their minds. Every glance, every assumption. And as the aircraft began to taxi, a single question hung heavy in the cabin. If this was who she was, then what else had they misunderstood about the woman sitting quietly among them? The aircraft began to move, the low rumble beneath the cabin underscoring the shift that had already taken place. No one spoke. The man who had joked earlier stared at the seat back in front of him, jaw tight, as if hoping the moment could be rewound. The silk scarf woman lifted her glass, then set it back down untouched. Even the seasoned business travelers, people used to power and proximity, felt suddenly exposed. Mrs. Hale remained exactly as she had been before. Calm. Still. Unimpressed. The flight attendant returned to her side, posture noticeably different now, careful, respectful, almost reverent. "May I bring you anything, Mrs. Hale?" she asked softly. The woman smiled, the kind of smile that carried no victory in it. "Just water, please. Nothing more." That, somehow, unsettled the cabin even further. As the plane lifted off, the city dropping away beneath them, the man across the aisle finally leaned toward her, voice low and uncertain. "Mrs. Hale," he began, attempting a polite smile, earlier, I didn't realize." She turned to him then. Her eyes were steady, not cold, not warm, simply honest. "It's all right," she said. "You saw what you expected to see." He swallowed. "Still. I owe you an apology." She studied him for a brief moment, then nodded once. "Apologies matter most," she replied, "when they change what comes after." The words lingered. Further up the cabin, the captain glanced back through the open cockpit door, his eyes meeting the chief purser's. A silent exchange passed between them, one that had nothing to do with hierarchy and everything to do with respect. Because they both knew something the passengers did not. Mrs. Hale rarely traveled alone. She rarely traveled without purpose. And this flight, this route, this timing, this anonymity was not accidental. As the plane leveled off, she reached into her canvas bag again and withdrew the same unmarked envelope. This time, she didn't put it away. She rested it lightly on her lap, fingers brushing its edge. The man beside her noticed. So did the captain. And somewhere between 30,000 feet and the realization settling in around her, it became clear that the lesson of the day was not finished yet. Not by a long shot. The envelope remained untouched, but its presence seemed to draw the cabin's attention like a quiet gravity. Mrs. Hale gazed at it for a moment, then looked out the window as clouds slid past in slow, indifferent layers. To everyone else, it was just paper. To her, it carried weight, decisions made long before boarding, consequences that would unfold long after landing. The chief purser passed again, slower this time. His eyes flicked to the envelope, then away. He said nothing, but his steps betrayed a new tension. A few rows back, a man whispered to his wife, "Why would she be flying like this?" The wife shook her head. Maybe she wanted to see something. That guess was closer than they knew. Mrs. Hale shifted slightly in her seat, turning the envelope once, aligning its edge perfectly with the armrest. The motion was precise. Intentional. Years of boardrooms and quiet negotiations lived in gestures like that. Across the aisle, the man who had apologized watched her carefully now, not with judgment, but with unease. "May I ask," he said cautiously, "why you choose to travel without the usual arrangements?" She didn't answer right away. "When people know who you are," she said at last, "they behave differently. Sometimes better. Often worse." She met his eyes briefly. "I wanted to see how things work when no one is trying." He nodded slowly, understanding dawning too late to be comforting. Up front, the cockpit door opened again. The captain stepped out, this time not addressing the cabin, but walking past it, past first class entirely, toward the rear, as if checking something routine. As he passed 12A, he paused. "Everything comfortable, Mrs. Hale?" he asked quietly. "Yes," she replied. "Thank you, Captain." He hesitated, then added, "We'll be landing on time." She gave a small, knowing smile. "I expected we would." The captain continued on, but the words lingered strangely. On time felt like more than reassurance. Mrs. Hale rested her hand over the envelope at last. Somewhere ahead of them, an airport waited. Somewhere beyond that, a chain of decisions was already beginning to move. And the passengers who had laughed earlier, now watching her in silence, had no idea that this flight was not just carrying them to a destination. It was carrying consequences. The seatbelt sign chimed softly, but no one shifted. The cabin remained hushed, as if everyone sensed that something invisible was still unfolding. Mrs. Hale slid the envelope back into her bag, not hiding it now, just placing it where it belonged. She crossed her hands over it and closed her eyes briefly, the way someone does before a long conversation they've already rehearsed in their mind. Across first class, the atmosphere had changed completely. People spoke less. When they did, it was quieter. Measured. As if volume itself might betray them. The man who had laughed earlier stared out the window now, watching clouds drift past, his reflection faint in the glass. He replayed the moment in the aisle, the joke, the smirk, the certainty that he had belonged more than she did. His face tightened. Belonging, he realized too late, was not something you could see. A flight attendant approached with the water Mrs. Hale had asked for. She placed it gently on the tray, hands steady but eyes respectful. "If there's anything you need at all," she said, "please let me know." Mrs. Hale nodded. "I will." The attendant lingered a fraction longer than necessary, then moved on. A few rows back, someone finally dared to whisper, "Do you think she heard us?" Another voice answered quietly, "She heard everything." Mrs. Hale opened her eyes again and looked forward, not at anyone in particular, but at the cabin as a whole. Her gaze carried no anger. That, somehow, made it worse. She wasn't here to correct them. She was here to observe. The plane cruised steadily now, sunlight shifting across the aisle as they passed above the clouds. The captain's voice came over the intercom, professional, calm, announcing cruising altitude and a smooth flight ahead. Mrs. Hale listened carefully. When the announcement ended, she reached into her bag once more. This time, she withdrew her phone. No flashy case. No notifications exploding across the screen. Just a single message waiting. She read it. Then she typed a brief reply. Across the aisle, the man who had apologized noticed the change, not in her expression, but in the air around her. Something had clicked into place. "What happens when we land?" he asked quietly, unsure why he felt compelled to ask. Mrs. Hale looked at him, then back to her phone. "That depends," she said calmly, "on what people think this flight was about." She slipped the phone back into her bag and folded her hands again. And as the aircraft cut through the sky, carrying them steadily toward their destination, one thing became unmistakably clear to everyone in first class. Whatever lesson Mrs. Hale had come to learn, or teach, had not reached its conclusion yet. Not even close. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the crew prepared for the remainder of the flight, but the tension remained fully awake. Mrs. Hale shifted her seat back just enough to be comfortable. She looked like any other passenger settling in, yet the stillness around her had weight now, as if the flight itself were leaning toward her, waiting. The man beside her cleared his throat. "You travel often?" he asked, choosing a harmless question, something safe. "Often enough," she replied. "Less than I used to." "That must be nice," he said, then paused. "Having the choice." She turned to him again, and this time her expression softened, not sympathy, exactly, but understanding. "Choice," she said, "is something people assume comes with money. It doesn't. It comes with perspective." He nodded, unsure what to say to that. A sudden murmur rippled through first class as a flight attendant stopped beside a well-dressed couple 2 rows ahead. There was a quiet exchange, then the attendant gestured gently toward the rear of the cabin. The couple's expressions shifted, confusion, then something like concern. They gathered their things and stood. As they moved down the aisle, heads turned. No one asked why. Everyone guessed. Mrs. Hale watched them pass, her gaze unreadable. She took a slow sip of water, then set the glass down with deliberate care. Up front, the cockpit door opened once more. This time, the captain did not step out alone. He was joined by the airline's senior operations manager, someone who did not normally appear mid-flight. They spoke briefly with the chief purser, voices low. Then the purser straightened and began walking toward first class. Every step seemed louder than the last. He stopped beside Mrs. Hale's seat. "Mrs. Hale," he said respectfully, "may we have a word when it's convenient for you?" She looked up at him, calm as ever. "Now is fine." A few passengers shifted uncomfortably. Someone pretended to read a menu. Someone else stared straight ahead. Mrs. Hale unfastened her seatbelt and stood. The aisle seemed narrower as she stepped into it. As she followed the purser toward the front, the man beside her watched her go, a strange certainty settling in his chest. This wasn't about status. It was about reckoning. And as Mrs. Hale disappeared into the cockpit area, leaving behind a cabin full of unanswered questions, one truth began to dawn on everyone who had laughed, judged, or dismissed her earlier. Whatever happened next would not be quiet. And it would not be forgotten. The cockpit door closed behind Mrs. Hale with a muted click, sealing off the last trace of her from the cabin. For a long moment, no one moved. The man in her seat stared at the empty space beside him, the faint indentation in the leather cushions still warm. He hadn't realized how much the room had been anchored by her presence until it was gone. Whispers began again, hushed, fragmented. Why would operations be on board? Did you see how the captain spoke to her? This isn't normal. Minutes passed. 10, maybe more. The hum of the engines filled the silence like a held breath. Inside the cockpit, voices were low and controlled. From the cabin, nothing could be heard, but something could be felt. Decisions were being weighed. Lines were being drawn. Finally, the seatbelt sign chimed again. The purser's voice came over the intercom, carefully composed. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We'll be making a brief procedural adjustment before descent." No explanation. No reassurance. Just enough to unsettle. A passenger near the window frowned. "Procedural adjustment," he muttered. The man beside the empty seat swallowed. His eyes flicked toward the cockpit door again. At last, it opened. Mrs. Hale stepped back into the cabin. She looked unchanged, no sign of strain, no hint of triumph, but there was something final in her posture now, as if a chapter had quietly closed behind her. The purser followed her, then the operations manager. They stopped near the front of first class. "Thank you for your patience," the manager said, projecting calm authority. "We'll be addressing a few matters once we land." A few matters. Mrs. Hale returned to her seat and sat, fastening her seatbelt with a soft click. She caught the man's eye beside her. "It's begun," she said quietly. "What has?" he asked. She looked forward again, toward the nose of the plane, toward the sky slowly giving way to horizon. "Accountability," she replied. Outside, the clouds thinned. The ground began to take shape far below, roads, buildings, the suggestion of a city waiting. And as the aircraft started its descent, every passenger in first class understood one thing with absolute clarity. This landing would not feel like the end of a flight. It would feel like the beginning of something they hadn't seen coming. The plane tilted gently, beginning its descent, and the change in angle seemed to shift the mood once more. What had been quiet tension hardened into something sharper, anticipation edged with unease. Mrs. Hale adjusted the strap of her bag beneath the seat, her movements unhurried. She glanced down the aisle, noticing how eyes dropped the moment she looked their way. Earlier, she had been invisible. Now, she was unavoidable. The man beside her leaned closer, lowering his voice. "You knew this would happen, didn't you?" "I suspected it might," she said. "People reveal themselves when they think no one important is watching." He exhaled slowly. "And if they fail?" She didn't answer immediately. The question, clearly, was not new to her. Ahead, the operations manager spoke quietly with the purser again, their heads inclined. The captain remained in the cockpit, but his presence felt larger now, like a final authority waiting to speak. A soft chime sounded. The purser's voice returned, even more measured than before. Ladies and gentlemen, as we prepare for landing, please ensure your seats are upright and your seatbelts are fastened. Ordinary words. Extraordinary timing. Mrs. Hale followed the instruction, then folded her hands in her lap. Her phone buzzed once more. She didn't look at it right away. When she finally did, her lips pressed together, just slightly. Across the aisle, the man who had laughed earlier noticed the change. He leaned forward, hands clasped, his confidence long gone. Whatever game he thought he had been winning had clearly ended. The runway came into view through the windows, long, stark, inevitable. Mrs. Hale looked out at it, then down at the envelope still tucked inside her bag. She brushed her fingers against it, not opening it yet. Not here. The wheels touched down with a solid thump. The reverse engines roared, vibrating through the cabin, rattling nerves already on edge. As the plane slowed, applause usually followed. This time, there was none. The aircraft rolled toward the gate, every second stretching longer than the last. When it finally stopped, the seatbelt sign remained on. No one stood. The purser stepped into the aisle once more, but before he could speak, Mrs. Hale raised a hand, calm, controlled. "I think," she said quietly, "it's time we spoke openly." Heads turned. Breath caught. And as she began to rise from her seat again, the silence that followed was so complete it felt deliberate. Whatever she was about to say would change how this flight was remembered. And she knew it. Mrs. Hale stood fully now, steadying herself with one hand on the seat back in front of her. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "I boarded this flight as a private citizen," she said, her tone even, carrying effortlessly through the still cabin. "I asked for no special treatment. I wore nothing that announced who I was. And I listened." A few passengers shifted, the sound of fabric against leather unnaturally loud. "I listened to how people spoke when they believed status gave them permission," she continued. "To what they laughed at. To who they thought mattered." Her eyes moved slowly down the aisle, not accusing, simply observing. Some people met her gaze. Others couldn't. The operations manager stepped forward slightly, as if to intervene, then stopped himself. "This airline," Mrs. Hale said, "was built on the idea that respect is not a cabin class. It's a standard." The words landed heavily. She reached into her bag and withdrew the envelope at last. She didn't open it, she just held it, the thick paper unmistakably official. "There are policies in here," she went on, "and reports. Names, dates, patterns." She paused. "They weren't written for today. Today only confirmed them." The man beside her felt his chest tighten. This was no impulsive moment. This was a test that had been running long before takeoff. Mrs. Hale turned slightly toward the front of the cabin. "What happens next will happen on the ground, not in the air. But understand this, nothing that happened on this flight will be dismissed as a misunderstanding." The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm but firm. "Mrs. Hale speaks with my full cooperation." That did it. A collective realization rippled through first class, not fear, exactly, but something colder, certainty. Mrs. Hale slid the envelope back into her bag and slowly sat down. "I hope," she said, softer now, "that when you leave this plane, you remember how easily you forgot yourselves." The seatbelt sign remained on. The doors had not yet opened. And no one knew who would be walking off this aircraft the same way they had boarded it. The cabin doors finally opened with a muted hiss. Cool air rushed in, breaking the spell, but not the silence. Ground staff stood waiting, flanked by airline executives and a pair of compliance officers whose presence needed no explanation. Names were checked. Seats were noted. Quiet instructions were given. Some passengers were waved through. Others were asked, politely but firmly, to step aside. Mrs. Hale remained seated until the aisle cleared. When she stood at last, the chief purser met her with a respectful nod. "Thank you," he said simply. She returned the nod. "Thank you for listening." As she walked down the jet bridge, no one laughed. No one whispered. No one looked past her. Outside the terminal windows, the airline's logo gleamed in the afternoon light, unchanged, yet newly accountable. Behind her, investigations would unfold. Policies would be rewritten. Careers would quietly end. Training manuals would gain new chapters that never mentioned her name, but carried her lesson all the same. Mrs. Hale paused once, just before disappearing into the terminal. She looked back, not at the plane, but at the people. Power, she knew, didn't announce itself. It observed. It waited. And when it finally spoke, it didn't need to raise its voice. The flight was over. But the reckoning it carried had only just begun.